Good morning, everyone. Today we're diving into one of the most foundational chapters in sociological theory, Chapter 2 on classical grand theories. We'll be spending the next few hours exploring the ideas of five revolutionary thinkers who fundamentally changed and shaped how we understand society. Durkheim, Marx, Weber, Simmel, and Veblen. These are not just historical figures, their ideas are incredibly relevant to understanding our world today, from social media to global capitalism to bureaucratic institutions. So we'll break this into some manageable sections with time for discussion after each theorist. Don't hesitate to ask questions. You can, if you're viewing this, send me an email or comment. The ideas are complex, but they're also fascinating and applicable to your daily lives. By the end of this session, you should be able to do 6 key things. First, understanding what makes a theory grand. So these are just not small scale explanations, but sweeping analysis of entire historical periods and social transformations. Second, we'll see how Durkheim explains the shift from traditional to modern society through his concepts of mechanical and organic solidarity. So think about how different your social relationships are from those in a small village a century ago. Third, Marx's analysis of capitalism remains incredibly relevant, whether you're thinking about gig work, income inequality, or workplace dynamics. Fourth, Weber's rationalization thesis helps explain everything from bureaucratic red tape to the efficiency obsession in modern organizations. Fifth, Simmel's tragedy of culture speaks directly to our digital age, how we are increasingly controlled by technologies we don't understand. And finally, Veblen's insights about conspicuous consumption are everywhere, visible from Instagram to luxury brands. So what exactly is a grand theory? So think of it as sociology's equivalent to a sweeping historical epic. These theories attempt to explain massive social changes over long periods of time. They're grand because of their ambition and scope. For example, imagine trying to explain how we went from agricultural societies, where most people live their entire lives in the same village, to our current global digital urban world. Well, that's the kind of massive transformation these theorists have tackled. These are not just academic exercises. Grand theories help us understand how we got to where we are today and where we might be heading. So when you see headlines about automated replacing jobs, global inequality, the power of tech companies, you're seeing the kinds of issues grand theorists address. Contemporary examples might include theories about globalization, the information age, or climate change. All attempt to explain sweeping social transformations. So to understand these theorists, we need to picture the world they live in. The late 1800s and early 1900s were a time of unprecedented change. Imagine living through a transformation as dramatic as the shift from agricultural to industrial. People were moving from rural areas to rapidly growing cities. Traditional ways of life that existed for centuries were disappearing within a generation. New technologies like railroads and factories were changing how people worked and lived. Political revolutions were changing and challenging traditional authority. It was both exciting and terrifying, full of new opportunities, but also new problems like urban poverty, labor exploitation, and social fragmentation. Our theorists were trying to make sense of all the chaos and figure out where it was heading. Think about how you might feel if artificial intelligence suddenly changed every aspect of society within your lifetime. This is the kind of disruption these thinkers were analyzing. Here are our five main characters. Notice most of them are German. Germany was going through a particularly rapid industrialization and was a center of intellectual innovation. Durkheim was French and considered by many to be the founder of sociology as a scientific discipline. He was obsessed with social order and what holds societies together. Marx is probably the most famous. He was actually more of a political activist than an academic. His ideas shaped revolutionary movements worldwide, though often in ways he would not have supported. Weber is arguably the most influential in modern society. He was deeply concerned about the bureaucratic nature of modern life, what he called the iron cage of rationality. Simmel was more focused on culture and individual experiences within larger social forces. He had insights that feel very relevant to our digital age. Veblen was American and had a biting critique of wealth and status consumption. That sounds remarkably contemporary when you think about social media culture and influencers. Let's start with Emil Durkheim, who many consider the most important founder of sociology. Durkheim was trying to understand a fundamental question: what holds society together? And how does this change as societies modernize? His answer involves one of sociology's most important concepts: social solidarity. But he argued that the kind of solidarity that exists in traditional societies is fundamentally different from what we see in modern societies. This isn't just an academic distinction. It explains a lot about modern problems like political polarization, social isolation, and moral confusion. So as we go through his theory, think about your own experience. How connected do you feel to your community? What creates that connection? How is it different from what your grandparents might have experienced growing up in smaller, more traditional communities? Durkheim's central insight is that there are fundamentally different ways societies can be held together, what he calls mechanical and organic solidarity. Mechanical solidarity exists when people are bound together because they are similar. They do the same work. They share the same beliefs. They have the same experiences. Think of a small farming community where everyone knows everyone else, shares the same religion, and face the same challenges. The solidarity is mechanical because it's based on similarity, like identical parts in a machine. Organic solidarity is different. It's based on difference. and interdependence. So in modern society, we're connected not just because we're the same, but because we are different. We need each other. The farmer needs the mechanic, who needs the teacher, who needs the doctor, and so on. So it's organic, like organs in a body, different parts performing different functions, but dependent on each other. The key insight is that as societies modernize, they shift from mechanical to organic solidarity. This creates both opportunities and problems that we still deal with today. So, what causes this shift from mechanical to organic solidarity? Durkheim's answer is dynamic density. So, essentially, more people interacting more frequently. Imagine being in a frontier territory with just a few families spread out over a large area. There's very little competition because there's plenty of land and resources for everyone. But as the population grows and people interact more through trade, migration, or population growth, competition increases. So now you have multiple families wanting the same good farmland or competing for the same water sources. This creates conflict unless people find ways to specialize. Maybe one family becomes really good at farming and another at blacksmithing and another at trading. Suddenly, instead of everyone competing for the same things, they're depending on each other for different things. This is exactly what happened during industrialization. So cities grew rapidly. People from different backgrounds were thrown together, and the solution was increased specialization and division of labor. Think about how specialized modern jobs are compared to a century ago. This is the process Durkheim is describing. One of Durkheim's most important concepts is the collective conscious. Basically, the shared ideas, values, and beliefs of a group. But here's the key insight. This collective conscious changes dramatically as we move from mechanical to organic solidarity. So think about in a small traditional community, mechanical solidarity, the collective conscious is strong. It's very strong. Everyone knows what the community believes. Everyone feels strongly about those beliefs. And there is a lot of social pressure to conform. Think about a small religious community where everyone shares the same faith, attends the same church, has social life that revolves around shared religious practices. In modern society, organic solidarity, the collective conscience is much weaker. We can have more diverse beliefs. People can more easily avoid social pressure, and there's less consensus about what's right and wrong. Think about political discussions in a diverse university setting. People have very different views, and there is no single authority that everyone accepts. This has positive and negative consequences. More individual freedom, but also more uncertainty and potential for conflict. Durkheim argued that you can actually see the shift from mechanical to organic solidarity by looking at how societies handle law and punishment. In societies with mechanical solidarity, punishment tends to be repressive. It's harsh, it's swift, and focused on making the offenders suffer. The goal is to reaffirm the collective conscience by showing what happens when you violate community standards. Think of historical examples like public execution, stocks in the town square, or exile from the community. The punishment is emotional and symbolic. In societies with organic solidarity, law becomes more restitutive, focused on fixing the damage and restoring normal functioning. The goal isn't to make someone suffer, but to repair the harm and prevent future problems. So think of modern examples like civil lawsuits, community service, or rehab programs. So this doesn't mean modern societies don't have harsh punishments, but the overall trend is toward more rational, restorative approaches to justice. When you see debates about criminal justice reform, restorative justice, or prison reform, you're seeing the tension between repressive and restitutive approaches. Durkheim revolutionized sociology by arguing that social phenomena should be studied as social facts, things that are external to individuals but constrain their behavior. This might sound abstract, but it's actually very practical. So look around your classroom, the physical layout, rows of desks facing forward, a podium at the front. This is a material social fact. It existed before you got here. It shapes your behavior. You're more likely to look forward than chat with people behind you, and it will exist after you leave. But you did not choose this arrangement, but it does influence how you act. Non-material social facts are unwritten rules. Don't talk during lectures. Raise your hand to ask questions. Show up on time. These may not be written down anywhere, but they are just as real and constraining as the physical layout. Durkheim's point is that society isn't just the sum of individual choices. There are actually social forces that shape what we can and cannot do, often without us even realizing it. So when you study abroad and you feel confused by different social norms, you're experiencing the power of social facts. Now we get to one of Durkheim's most famous and relevant concepts, anomie. This is basically a state of normlessness or confusion about what's expected of you. In traditional societies with strong collective conscience, people have very clear guidelines about how to behave. Social roles are well defined, moral rules are clear, and there's very little confusion about what's to be expected. But in modern societies with a weak collective conscience, people often feel adrift. Social rules are unclear. There are competing moral systems, and people aren't sure what is expected of them. This is anomie. Think about contemporary examples. So college students, you're a college student, you may experience anomie when you leave home and the clear rules of family and high school are gone. And you have to figure out your own values and goals. People in the gig economy might feel anomie because traditional career paths and workplace norms no longer apply. Social media creates anomie because the rules for online behavior are constantly changing. Durkheim saw this as a serious social problem, but not an insurmountable one. He did believe that society could develop new forms of moral regulation appropriate to modern conditions. Now let's turn to Karl Marx, probably the most misunderstood thinker we will study. Marx has been both demonized and idealized, but often for the wrong reasons. The communist regimes that claim to follow Marx actually created the kind of oppressive, bureaucratic societies that Marx himself would have opposed. He was fundamentally concerned with human freedom and potential. He believed that capitalism, despite its productive achievements, prevented most people from developing their full human capabilities. His goal wasn't to create a totalitarian state, but to envision a society where people could be truly free and creative. As we go through Marx's ideas, try to put aside whatever preconceptions you might have about communism or socialism. Focus on his analysis of how capitalism works and his insights about work, class, and human nature. Whether you agree or not with his solutions, his diagnosis of capitalism's problems remain remarkably insightful. Before we dive into Marx's theory, let's clear up some common misperceptions. Marx wasn't responsible for Stalin's Soviet Union or Mao's China any more than Jesus was responsible for the Spanish Inquisition. The regimes used Marx's name, but created exactly the kind of oppressive society Marx was opposed to. Marx was a product of the Enlightenment tradition that emphasized human reason, freedom, and progress. He was deeply influenced by German philosophy, French socialism, and British economics. In fact, he spent most of his life in London studying capitalism at its most advanced stage. Marx lived through the absolute worst period of early industrial capitalism, child labor, 16-hour workdays, dangerous working conditions, extreme poverty alongside extreme wealth. He was not just theorizing about inequality, he was witnessing it firsthand. His goal was to understand how capitalism worked as a system and to envision an alternative that would allow human beings to reach their full potential. Whether you think his solutions are workable, whether you think they're not, he still is very influential in capitalism's problems. Marx started with a fundamentally optimistic view of human nature. He believed that humans had tremendous creative potential that was suppressed throughout most of history by economic necessity and social oppression. Think about what makes humans unique from other animals. We can plan ahead. We can imagine alternatives. We can work together on complex projects. We can create art and technology. Marx called this our species being, our essentially human characteristics. But throughout history, most people have been just too busy surviving to develop these capabilities. In pre-capitalist societies, people spent most of their time finding food and shelter. Under capitalism, people have more material security, but the work they do is often repetitive, uncreative, and controlled by others. Marx's vision was that once we solve the problem of material scarcity, which capitalism's productive capacity makes possible, we could create a society where people were free to develop their full human potential. People could be truly creative work collaboratively, and engage in fulfilling activities rather than just earning a living. Marx's concept of alienation explains why work under capitalism often feels unsatisfying, even when it pays well. Alienation means being separated from things that should naturally be connected. So, first, Marx talks about alienation from productive activities. Think about a job where you have no control over what you do or how you do it. Maybe you work at a call center where you have to follow a script, or you're an assembly line worker where you repeat the same task. You can't be creative or use your judgment. You are just following orders. Marx would say you are alienated from your own labor. Second, alienation from products. You might work for a company that makes products you can't afford to buy or that you think are harmful. Or maybe you just do data entry, but you never see how your work contributes to the final product. So there's no connection between what you do, your effort, and the result. Third, alienation from fellow workers. Instead of working collaboratively, capitalism often puts workers in competition with each other. Think about workplaces where people compete for promotions or where your performance is evaluated against your coworkers rather than focusing on shared goals. Fourth, alienation from human potential. So instead of developing your capabilities, your work just becomes mind numbing and repetitive. You come home exhausted with no energy for any creative projects or personal growth. Marx simplified capitalist society into two main classes based on their relationship to the means of production. So basically, who owns the tools, factories, and resources needed to produce things? The capitalist, or the bourgeoisie, own the means of production. This doesn't just mean factory owners, it includes anyone who owns significant capital. So, shareholders, real estate investors, business owners, they make money not by working a job, but by owning things that other people use to work. The proletariat, or the working class, do not own significant capital, so they have to sell their labor to survive. This includes not just factory workers, but let's be real, most people who work for wages or salaries, teachers, nurses, office workers, retail employees. The key insight is that these classes have fundamentally different interests. Workers want higher wages, better conditions, and more control over their work. Capitalists want lower costs, including labor costs, and higher profits. This creates an inherent conflict that cannot be resolved within capitalism. Think about a contemporary example: conflict over minimum wage, unions, benefits, or even workplace safety. These aren't just policy disagreements, they reflect the deep structural conflict that Marx identified. Marx's labor theory of value is one of his most important but controversial ideas. So, the basic argument is that all economic value ultimately comes from human labor. So, think about any product, let's say a smartphone. What makes it valuable? The raw materials like metals and silicon that came from the earth, but those had to be extracted by miners. So the components had to be manufactured by workers. The software had to be written by programmers. Even machines used in production were built by other workers. At every stage, it's human labor that transforms raw materials into something useful. Even when we build machines, those machines were built by workers and operated by workers. So if all value comes from labor, then why do capitalists get a profit? Marx's answer is that they extract surplus value from workers. Workers are paid less than the value they create, and capitalists keep the difference as profit. Now, this sort of kind of sounds maybe abstract to you, but think about it practically. If a worker generates $100 worth of value per hour, but is paid $20 per hour, where does the extra $80 go? Marx would say it goes to the capitalist as profit, even though the capitalist didn't create that value. Marx believed that capitalism contained the seeds of its own destruction, but workers would have to actively create change. It would not happen automatically. False consciousness means that both workers and capitalists misunderstand their situation. Workers might think they're getting a fair deal or that their interests align with their employers. Capitalists might think they deserve the wealth because they work hard or take risk. But Marx believed that as capitalism developed, its contradictions would become more obvious. Economic crisis, increasing inequality, and deteriorating work conditions would make it harder to maintain these illusions. Class consciousness means workers recognizing their shared interests and understanding how capitalism really works. Okay, this isn't just an intellectual understanding. It is a collective recognition that leads to an action. Well, think about contemporary examples. The fight for the $15 minimum wage movement, where fast food workers recognize their shared experiences across different companies, or how the 2008 financial crisis led many people to question whether the economic system was really working for them. These are examples of growing class consciousness. But Marx emphasized that consciousness alone isn't enough. Workers must engage in praxis or concrete action to change their conditions. Marx was deliberately vague about what communist society would look like, and for a good reason. He thought it was arrogant to try to map out the future, and he wanted to focus on understanding and changing current conditions rather than dreaming about some utopia. But he did offer some key principles. That society would be classless without the division between those who own the capital and those who sell their labor. It would be stateless without the coercive apparatus needed to maintain class divisions. And it would allow people to develop their full human potential. Marx's famous phrase, from each according to ability to each according to need, basically captures his idea. People would contribute what they could and receive what they needed without the mediation of money, markets, or state bureaucracy. While this sounds impossibly idealistic, Marx thought it was practical. Capitalism had already developed the productive capacity to meet everyone's basic needs. The problem wasn't scarcity, but the social organization that created artificial scarcity alongside abundance. So whether or not you think Marx's vision was realistic, his point about capitalism's productive potential remains relevant. We live in a world with unprecedented wealth alongside persistent poverty and insecurity. Now we turn to Max Weber, who many consider the most sophisticated of the classical theorists. Weber was deeply influenced by Marx, but he thought the analysis was just too simple. Weber saw multiple causes of social change, not just economics. His central concern was with rationalization, the increasing dominance of rational, systematic, rule-based thinking in all areas of life. He saw this as a defining characteristic of modern Western civilization. Weber had a complex relationship with rationalization. On one hand, he recognized its benefits, efficiency, predictability, technological progress. On the other hand, he worried about the cost, the loss of meaning, creativity, and human values. The metaphor Weber used was the iron cage. Modern life increasingly traps us in rational systems that constrain our freedom and spontaneity. As we go through Weber's analysis, think about your own experience with bureaucracy, rules, and systematic procedures. Do they make life better or worse? Weber distinguished four types of rationality, but his key insight was that only one of them, formal rationality, was unique to the modern West. Practical rationality is just everyday problem solving. If your usual route to school is blocked, you take a different route. Every society throughout history has had practical rationality. Theoretical rationality is systematic thinking about the world, science, philosophy, mathematics. This has also existed in many societies, though it's more developed in some than others. Substantive rationality means acting according to your values or beliefs. If your religion says to pray 5 times a day, that's substantively rational within that value system. This also exists in all societies. But formal rationality is different. It means following rules and procedures regardless of outcomes or values. A bureaucrat who follows regulations even when they produce stupid results is being formally rational. This type of rationality, Weber argued, only developed in the modern West and has come to dominate our institutions. So think about examples from your own life. Having to fill out forms that seem pointless, following procedures that don't make sense, dealing with automatic systems that can't handle your specific situation. That is formal rationality. Weber's big question was, why did formal rationality develop only in the modern West? This wasn't just academic curiosity. It was trying to understand what made Western civilization unique. Other civilizations had science, technology, trade, and sophisticated institutions. Ancient China had advanced bureaucracy. The Islamic world preserved and extended Greek philosophy, and many societies had complex economic systems. But nowhere else did you see the systematic, rule-based rationality that characterized modern Western institutions. Bureaucratic government, capitalist enterprise, scientific method, legal systems based on abstract principles rather than tradition. Weber's answer was that religion played the crucial role. Specifically, Protestant Christianity created a cultural orientation that promoted rational, systematic behavior in ways that other religions didn't. This might seem strange. We often think of religion as irrational, but Weber showed how certain religious beliefs could actually promote rational behavior in worldly affairs. The Protestant ethic didn't just permit capitalist behavior, it made us a religious duty. The Protestant ethic, especially in its Calvinist form, created a unique psychological situation that promoted rational capitalist behavior. Calvinists believed in predestination. Predestination is where God has already decided who would be saved and who would be damned, and there was nothing that you could do to change that decision. This created tremendous anxiety. How could you know if you were among the selected? Calvinist theology said, well, you couldn't know for certain, but you could look for signs of divine favor. And one of the most important signs was being successful in worldly activities, especially business. So this belief created a powerful motivation for a systematic, rational pursuit of profit. It wasn't greed. Calvinists were supposed to live simply and avoid luxury. The goal was to demonstrate divine favor through methodical, successful work. Think about the psychological dynamic. You're anxious about your eternal fate. You believe worldly success is a sign of divine favor, but you can't pursue pleasure or luxury. The result is what Weber called spirit of capitalism, systematic, rational, methodical pursuit of profit for its own sake, not for the enjoyment money can buy. Weber traced how the Protestant ethic gradually evolved into what he called the spirit of capitalism, a cultural orientation that made rational capitalist behavior seem natural and necessary. The key components were systematic profit seeking, not just getting rich quick, frugality and reinvestment rather than consumption, punctuality and reliability in business dealings, and treating money making as a legitimate end in itself rather than just a means to other goals. Weber's evidence came from examining European regions where multiple religions coexisted. He found that business leaders, skilled workers, and technically trained personnel were disproportionately Protestant, even when Catholics had equal opportunities. This suggested that cultural factors, not just economic or political ones, played a crucial role in capitalist development. The Protestant ethic provided the cultural foundation that made people want to behave in ways that supported capitalist institutions. Over time, Weber argued, capitalism became self-sustaining and no longer needed religious motivation. The iron cage of economic necessity forced everyone to behave capitalistically, regardless of their religious beliefs. But understanding this religious origin helps explain why capitalism developed where and when it did. Weber used comparative analysis to test his theory by examining why capitalism didn't develop in societies with different religious traditions. So in China, Confucianism emphasized literary education and cultural refinement over practical business activity. The ideal Confucian gentleman was supposed to be above mundane concerns like making money. Wealth was acceptable, but not the systematic pursuit of wealth through work. Confucianism also emphasized maintaining harmony in traditional relationships rather than the innovative competitive behavior that capitalism requires. There was no theological tension that needed resolution through worldly success. In India, Hinduism's caste system and the emphasis on spiritual rather than material achievement created different barriers. If your social position was determined by karma from past lives, there was little incentive to try to improve your material situation through business. Weber's point wasn't that these religions were inferior, but they created cultural orientations that did not promote rational capitalist behavior. So this helps explain why capitalism emerged first in Protestant regions of Europe, rather than in societies that were equally sophisticated in other ways. Weber's analysis of authority types helps explain the broader process of rationalization in political and social institutions. Traditional authority is based on custom and inheritance. We've always done it this way, or this family has always ruled. So think of monarchies, tribal leadership, or even family businesses passed down through generations. It's legitimate because it's traditional, not because it's efficient or fair. Charismatic authority is based on the extraordinary personal qualities of a leader, their ability to inspire, their perceived connection to the divine, or their revolutionary wisdom. Think of religious prophets, revolutionary leaders, or even some contemporary politicians who inspired devoted followers. It's powerful but unstable because it depends on one person. Rational legal authority is based on rules and procedures rather than traditional or personal qualities. Think of elected officials whose authority comes from winning elections according to established procedures, or bureaucrats whose power comes from their official position rather than their personal characteristics. Weber predicted that rational legal authority would become dominant in modern society because it's more efficient and predictable than the alternatives. Weber's iron cage metaphor captures his ambivalence about rationalization. Rational bureaucratic organization is incredibly efficient, but it also constrains human freedom and creativity. Think about your experiences with large institutions, your university, government agencies, corporations. They can accomplish amazing things through systematic organization, but they can also be very frustrating, impersonal, and unresponsive to an individual's needs. Weber worried that as rationalization spread to all areas of life, people would become trapped in systems that prioritize efficiency over human values. We'd become like cogs in a machine, following rules and procedures without thinking about larger purposes or meanings. The cage is iron because it's very difficult to escape once these rational systems are established. They become so efficient and dominant, their alternatives seem impossible. Even if you want to do things differently, you're forced to conform to bureaucratic procedures. Weber saw this as the price of modernity. We gain efficiency, predictability, and material progress, but we lose spontaneity, creativity, and meaning. This tension between rational efficiency and human values remains central to debates about modern society. Georg Simmel offers a different perspective on modernity that feels remarkably contemporary. While Marx focused on class conflict and Weber on rationalization, Simmel was interested in culture and individual experience in modern society. His tragedy of culture speaks directly to our digital age. So think about how much technology surrounds us that we don't understand. Smartphones, the internet, AI that affect our lives. We're increasingly dependent on our cultural products that go beyond our individual comprehension or control. Simmel saw this as an inevitable consequence of social development, but also as a serious problem for individual freedom and autonomy. As we will see, his insights are remarkably relevant to contemporary debates about technology, specialization, and the pace of cultural change. Simmel's distinction between objective and individual culture is crucial for understanding his theory. Objective culture consists of all things humans have created: art, science, technology, institutions, knowledge. Think about everything around you right now: the building you're in, the writing system we use, the scientific knowledge that went into creating your laptop, the economic systems that made this classroom possible. Individual culture is your personal capacity to understand, use, and control these cultural products. How much do you really understand about the technology you use daily? Could you build a smartphone? Or could you even fully explain how one works? Do you understand the economic systems that determine your job prospects? The tragedy is that objective culture grows exponentially. New technologies, new knowledge, new institutions, while individual culture grows much more slowly. Each generation knows more in total than previous generations, but individuals understand a smaller and smaller fraction of their total culture. This creates a paradox. We become more powerful collectively, but less powerful individually. We can, as a society, do amazing things, but we feel increasingly helpless as individuals. The tragedy in Simmel's tragedy of culture is that we become increasingly dominated by our own creations. It's tragic because it's not the result of evil intentions or bad policies. It's the inevitable consequence of cultural development. Think about your relationship with technology. Your smartphone probably contains more computing power than was used to send humans to the moon. But how much do you really understand about how it works? You are completely dependent on it, but you have almost no control over how it's designed or updated. The same pattern applies to economic systems, political institutions, scientific knowledge, and cultural products. They become increasingly complex and sophisticated, but also increasingly beyond individual comprehension or control. Simmel saw this as creating a fundamental alienation, not Marx's alienation from work, but alienation from culture itself. We live in a world shaped by human creativity, but it feels foreign and controlling rather than empowering. The internet is a perfect example. It's an amazing human achievement that connects us with the world and democratizes information, but it also creates new forms of surveillance, manipulation, and dependence that we barely understand. Simmel saw the division of labor as the main driver of the tragedy of culture. Specialization allows us to create increasingly sophisticated cultural products, but it also fragments our understanding. Think about your own education. You're probably developing deep knowledge in your major field, but you know less and less about other areas. A computer science might understand programming, but not history. A literature major might understand poetry, but not economics. This specialization is needed for advanced knowledge, but it means each person understands only a tiny sliver of total culture. The benefits are obvious. Specialization allows for incredible advances in every field. Medical specialists can perform surgeries that would have been impossible a generation ago. Engineers can design systems of amazing complexity and precision, but the costs are also real. Specialists often can't communicate across fields. Problems that require interdisciplinary understanding become harder to solve. Individuals feel less competent and more dependent on experts in other fields. More importantly, we lose the ability to see the big picture. We might understand our small corner of the world, but we have trouble understanding how everything fits together. Thorstein Veblen was the only American among our classical theorists, and his insights about consumption, status, and economic waste feel remarkably contemporary. If you've ever wondered why people buy expensive designer clothes with visible logos, or why social media is full of lifestyle posts, Veblen provides the analysis. Veblen was writing over a century ago, but his concepts of conspicuous consumption and conspicuous leisure speak directly to our Instagram culture. He also had a biting critique of how business interests can conflict with productive efficiency, something we see in debates about planned obsolescence, environmental destruction, and financial speculation. Veblen had a unique perspective as an outsider. He came from a Norwegian immigrant farming family and never quite fit into elite academic circles. This gave him a sharp eye for the absurdities of upper class behavior and business culture. Veblen's core insight was that business and industry have fundamentally different goals, and this creates a conflict that hurts society. Industry is about making useful things efficiently. Think of engineers designing better products, workers improving manufacturing processes, or scientists developing new technologies. The goal is to produce more and better goods with less waste and effort. Business is about making money. Think of the financial speculation, planned obsolescence designed to force frequent replacements, or marketing campaigns that create artificial demand. The goal is profit, regardless of whether this actually improves production or helps society. Veblen argued that business interests often conflict with industrial efficiency. For example, a company might deliberately design products to break down after a few years to ensure repeat consumers, even though this wastes resources and frustrates customers. Or financial speculation might divert investments away from productive activities toward activities that make money but do not create real value. Contemporary examples include the 2008 financial crisis, where financial engineering created profits for banks but damaged the real economy, or tech companies designing products to become addictive rather than useful. Veblen's analysis helps explain why we sometimes see economic inefficiency alongside great productive potential. Business strategy often involves creating artificial scarcity. Think of how luxury brands limit production to maintain high prices, or how pharmaceutical companies price medication far above production cost. From an industrial perspective, this is wasteful. We could produce more goods at lower cost, but from a business perspective, it's rational because it maximizes profits. Veblen was writing about this over a century ago, but we see the same patterns today. We have the technical capacity to solve many problems: climate change, poverty, disease. But business incentives often work against using that capacity effectively. Consider environmental issues. We have renewable energy technologies that could replace fossil fuels, but business interests that profit from the current system resist change. Or think about how much food is wasted while people go hungry, not because of production limitations, but because of business decisions about pricing and distribution. Veblen's point wasn't that business people are evil, but that the institutional structure of capitalism creates incentives that conflict with productive efficiency and social welfare. Veblen's concept of conspicuous consumption explains a lot about modern consumer culture and social media behavior. Conspicuous consumption means buying things not because you need them, but because they signal your status to others. The key word is conspicuous. It has to be visible to work as a status symbol. Think about designer clothing with visible logos, expensive cars, or luxury vacations that get posted on social media. The functional value might be the same as cheaper alternatives, but the status value is different. Veblen argued that this creates a kind of arms race where everyone tries to keep up with or surpass others in their social group. You might have heard the phrase, keeping up with the Jones. You buy expensive things to show you can afford them, which pressures others to do the same, which raises the bar for everyone. Social media has intensified this dynamic in ways Veblen could never have imagined. Instagram and other platforms make conspicuous consumption more visible and create pressure to constantly display your lifestyle. The number of likes and comments becomes a measure of status success. This isn't just individual vanity. Veblen saw it as systematic waste of resources, those that could be used for productive purposes instead of status competition. Conspicuous leisure was Veblen's term for displaying status through visible waste of time rather than money. Historically, the ultimate status symbol was not having to work. Think of European aristocracy with their elaborate social rituals, or the Chinese Mandarin class with their focus on literary culture rather than a practical skill. Having leisure time showed that you were above the necessity of productive work. Now that we've covered all five theorists, let's step back and see how their ideas relate to each other. Notice that they are all analyzing the same historical transformation, the shift from traditional to modern society, but they focus on different aspects and reach different conclusions. Durkheim focuses on social integration and sees both opportunities and problems in modern society. Marx focuses on economic relations and sees capitalism as fundamentally exploitive. Weber focuses on rationalization and worries about the iron cage of bureaucracy. Simmel focuses on culture and sees individuals becoming overwhelmed by their own creations. Veblen focuses on status and consumption and sees systematic waste. But there are important connections. Weber's rationalization relates to Marx's alienation. Both see modern institutions as constraining human potential. Simmel's tragedy of culture connects to Durkheim's enemy. Both involve the loss of individual control and understanding. Veblen's conspicuous consumption relates to Marx's analysis of how capitalism shapes consciousness. They also share a critical perspective on modernity. All recognize the achievements of modern society, but all identify serious problems that need to be addressed. Despite their different focuses, these theorists share several important concerns that remain relevant today. First, they're all trying to understand massive social transformation. The shift from agriculture to industrial society was as dramatic as any change in human history, and we are still living with its consequences. Today, we might be experiencing an equally dramatic shift to a digital global society. Second, they all grapple with a tension between individual freedom and social forces. Modern society creates new opportunities for individual choice and development, but it also creates new forms of constraint and control. This tension shows up in contemporary debates about privacy, surveillance, work-life balance, and social media. Third, they all see both progress and problems in modernization. None of them are simply nostalgic for the past, but none of them think modern society is perfect. They're trying to understand how we can keep the benefits of modernity while addressing its cost. Finally, they all believe that understanding society scientifically can help us make it better. So they're not just describing social change, they're trying to provide tools for improving human life. These classical theorists are not just historical curiosities. They provide frameworks for understanding contemporary issues. Globalization. How do we understand the integration of world markets, migration, and cultural exchange? Durkheim's concepts of solidarity and Marx's analysis of capitalism provide tools for analyzing global inequality and cultural conflict. Under technology, how do we understand the impact of social media, AI, and digital platforms? Simmel's tragedy of culture and Weber's rationalization help explain why we feel both empowered and controlled by technology. Inequality. How do we understand persistent and growing economic inequality? Marx's class analysis and Veblen's insights about conspicuous consumptions provide perspectives on wealth concentration and status competition. The environment. How do we understand the conflict between economic growth and ecological sustainability? Veblen's analysis of business versus industry can help explain why profitable activities are not always socially beneficial. These theorists provide conceptual tools that are still useful for analyzing contemporary problems, even though these specific issues have changed. Let's pause here to look at our discussion questions. I want you to think about how these classical insights apply to your own experience and contemporary issues. You will see this later. First question, how do the classical insights apply to social media and digital culture? Think about Simmel's tragedy of culture. Are we controlled by technologies we don't understand? Or Veblen's conspicuous consumption. Is social media a new form of status competition? Second, which theorist analysis best explains contemporary inequality? Marx would focus on class relations. Weber might emphasize credentialism and bureaucracy. Veblen would look at status consumption. Third, what would each theorist say about globalization? Think about how their concepts might apply to global economic integration, cultural exchange, and international institutions. Fourth, how do their concepts relate to modern work? Think about the gig work, remote work, or automation in terms of alienation, rationalization, and enemy. Finally, what new, quote, grand theories might be needed for the 21st century? What aspects of contemporary society would require theories these classical thinkers couldn't anticipate? So this chapter on classical grand theories provides the foundation for everything else we will study in this course. Next, we'll look at how contemporary theorists have built on, modified, or rejected these insights. Thinkers like Habermas and Giddens continue the grand theory tradition, but address issues the classical theorists could not anticipate, like environmental crisis, global communication, or gender relations. We'll also study more specialized theories that focus on specific aspects of social life rather than trying to explain everything. Symbolic interactionism looks at face-to-face interaction, conflict theory focuses on power relations, and functionalism examines how social institutions work together. But throughout the class, you'll see the influence of these classical thinkers. Modern sociology is still grappling with the questions they've raised and using conceptual tools they developed. For further study, I encourage you to read some of the original texts. They are a lot more accessible than you might think, and there's nothing quite like engaging with these ideas in the theorist's own words. Let me conclude by emphasizing why classical theory still matters. These theorists provided diagnostic tools for understanding social problems. You've already had this class, but this is what you'll be looking at. When you see inequality, alienation, bureaucratic dysfunction, or cultural conflict, you have conceptual frameworks for analyzing what's happening and why. They also provide historical perspectives. Many problems that seem new and unprecedented actually have roots in the fundamental tensions of modern society that these theorists identified over a century ago. Most importantly, they demonstrate the value of critical thinking about society. None of these thinkers simply accepted the status quo as natural or inevitable. They ask fundamental questions about how society works and whether it could work better. The grand theory tradition continues today because we still need sweeping analysis of social change. Climate change, artificial intelligence, globalization, and genetic engineering pose challenges that require the kind of ambitious theoretical thinking these classical sociologists pioneered. Your job as students is not just to learn these theories, but to develop your own capacity for critical analysis of the social world around you. If you want to deep dive into these ideas, here are some recommendations. For primary sources, start with the accessible works. Durkheim, The Division of Labor, is challenging but readable. Marx's Communist Manifesto is short and passionate. Weber's Protestant Ethic is probably the most influential single work in sociology. Semmel's essays are shorter and more impressionistic, and Veblen's Theory of the Leisure Class is witty and surprisingly contemporary. For secondary sources, these biographies provide good information and introductions to each of the theorists' life and historical context. Understanding their personal backgrounds and the societies they lived in help make sense of their theoretical concerns. I've also posted additional resources on the course website, including documentaries, podcasts, and contemporary applications of classical theory. Remember that these theorists were writing for educated general audiences, not just academics. Their goal was to help people understand and improve society, not to show off their theoretical sophistication. I know this is a lot of material, but these ideas form the foundation for everything else we will study. Take a minute to think about which theorist ideas resonate most with your own experience. Do you see evidence of Durkheim's anomie in contemporary life, Marx's alienation in modern work, Weber's iron cage in bureaucracy, Semmel's tragedy of culture in digital technology, Veblen's conspicuous consumption in social media? For our next class, please read Chapter 3 and come prepared to discuss how contemporary theorists have built on these classical foundations. We'll see how thinkers like Habermas, Giddens, and Foucault have adapted classical insights to address new challenges.